I'll let you know more when I go. When I go. They invited me to speak. I guess each year they have some religious leader come and speak, and so I said, sure, it'd be fun. Why not?
Maybe you'll hear some music.
Yeah, exactly. Um, Jewish Funders Network.
Oh.
Jewish Funders Network. What's that? I won't have time, unfortunately, and I've never been, and I've heard that it's really remarkable to go to. You know, I actually have a friend in New York. You wouldn't think this. He runs. He's the chair of United Hatzalah. He's a big Jewish philanthropist, married to a rabbi. Not only has he gone to Graceland, he's taken all of his kids to Graceland. He loves Graceland. He thinks it's fantastic.
Wow.
So, yeah. So I always tell him that I'll get there one day. One day. All right, it is 8:30, so I'm assuming we started. If we didn't start, then we are starting. I want to begin today by a quick mention of the last two parshiot, because we're finishing the book of Exodus, Vayakel Pekudei, and then I want to talk about the book of Exodus as a whole, especially as relates to Passover, since this Shabbat is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, is the beginning of the month of Nisan, which of course is the month of Passover, and yes, we are actually pretty close. The book of Exodus ends in a sort of resumptive repetition, which is kind of strange, about building the tabernacle. And there are lots of comments about why the Torah tells us how to build the tabernacle more than once. But it does, and at least part of it is because the tabernacle is in some ways a parallel to creation, some of the terminology, some of the ideas behind it, and also I think probably because we as a non-temple centered religion forget how central the temple and therefore the tabernacle was to our ancestors. And we've now had thousands of years without a temple, but most of Jewish history before then, which I guess another, I don't know how you measure most, but all of Jewish history before then was centered around a tabernacle and then a temple. And there was a sort of deep belief that in some sense God dwells more intensely in the tabernacle and the temple than the rest of the world, even though we've taken now the philosophical Maimonidean idea that God is the same everywhere and God knows everything. But as we saw last week or 2 weeks ago in the Torah doesn't talk about God that way. The Torah talks about God in much more human terms than philosophical terms. And even if you think, as the tradition generally does, that it speaks in human terms as a concession to the way human beings are, that's still, we're human beings. So it's a concession to the way we are, and therefore we ought to at least take seriously this sense that God is more present in some places than others, which is a sense we have too, right? And also that the locus of religious life was for our ancestors for a long time the temple, which is why even the outer wall of the temple today, which is the Western Wall, still gets such veneration. But I don't want to talk so much about that. I want to make several comments about Passover and the Exodus in the context of the Torah, because it's pretty clear, even if you read the entirety of the Torah, that in some ways the Exodus is the central event. Northrop Frye, in his book, whose name escapes me at the moment, who used to be a very famous book in literary criticism, says the Exodus is the only event the only mythological event that happens in the Torah, by which he doesn't mean it's the only thing that happens, but he means it is the central organizing event and everything in some way revolves around it. And the reason that that's so is not because, as we tend to think of it as moderns, it repudiates slavery and teaches that people should be free. Because while I hate to be a spoil sport, the Exodus doesn't really teach that. It doesn't teach that there should be no such thing as slavery and all people should be free. If it taught that, then Jews wouldn't have slaves, which they do in the rest of the Bible. And nobody says, how could you have a slave? After all, didn't the Exodus teach us that you should not have slavery and all human beings should be free? But the Exodus doesn't teach it all. It teaches that the Jews shouldn't be enslaved in Egypt, but it doesn't say that the Canaanites should not be enslaved in Canaan when they get there. Now, it's true that slavery was a principle, I don't know, that doesn't seem to be on the page, or maybe it is and I'm not getting it yet. Does not seem to be a principle that that is like dear to Judaism, and it does obviously mitigate slavery in lots of ways. But I want to return us to the original idea, however you explain it at your Passover Seder, that the idea of the Exodus is that the Jews should not be slaves to other people, they should be slaves to God. It's not that they should be autonomous, choosing people and do whatever they want, which is the modern American read of the Exodus. And it's not that I don't like that read, but I want to be honest that that's not the read in the Torah. If the read in the Torah was that you are now free to do whatever you want, then why is it that right after they leave, God gives them all these commandments and says, you have to do this and this and this and this. And for a lot of the commandments, there are some pretty severe punishments. So one of the, I think, responsibilities of modern Jews is to recognize when they are deviating from the tradition, as opposed to pretending that the tradition says what it is that they want it to say. And nowhere in here does it say that human beings ought to be autonomous creatures and do what they want. Rather, the highest freedom is considered service to God. That's when you're fulfilling your purpose as a human being. Because for the Torah, like for Aristotle, like for Greek philosophy, freedom is teleological. That is, freedom is for a greater purpose than freedom. We think freedom is its own purpose. But to the Torah, freedom for its own purpose is chaos. It's not freedom. If everybody does whatever they feel like doing for their own purpose, you're not going to get an ordered society, and ultimately, you're not going to get freedom, right? And what grants humanity its greatest freedom is proper service to God. And that's why Judaism has a theory of state unlike, say, early Christianity. And I'll come to that in a second. Because like Islam, remember, here's a big difference between Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. And in this, Islam and Judaism are on one side and Christianity on the other. Judaism and Islam were born in the desert. In the desert, you don't have a state, so you have to make one. So the rules of Judaism and Islam, the basic rules at the beginning, are civil laws as well as what we think of as religious practices, right? A lot of the Talmud is what happens if my ox gores your ox. Civil stuff, not religious stuff. And that's because you have these people in the desert, and occasionally, I don't know about oxes goring in the desert, but you get the idea, right? And occasionally things happen. Okay. Christianity grew up in the Roman Empire. Civil law was already set. Jesus couldn't come along and say, this is the fine if you steal. The Romans would say, what are you talking about? We have Roman courts and Roman law, and this is the fine if you steal. So Christianity became an entirely internal religion, Now, later on, by the way, when Christianity and the state fused, you got canon law, and then you started to have state law from the church. That's a whole separate question. But for the Torah, all law is the same. There's no such thing as religious law and civil law. There's Torah law. And stealing is covered under Torah law, just like not observing the Shabbos is covered under Torah law. Now, the rabbis understood that there was Bein Adam L'Chaveiro and Bein Adam L'Makom. There was between people and between people and God, and that those were different kinds of laws. But rabbinic authorities were they were like religious lawyers. If you study the Talmud, they talk about also boundaries and torts and all the things that lawyers talk about, because they were setting up a society. So the Exodus is in order to set up a different kind of society from a society in which Jews were slaves, and that society is service to God. Remember that God says, Shlach et ami, let my people go, vaya'avduni, and they will serve me. We only quote the first part of that, because in America, let my people go sounds great, right? Let my people go that they may serve me doesn't sound so good. But that's what Passover is really about, is you're liberated to service, and then all the symbolic meanings come into it. And in the Torah itself, the Passover happens sort of simultaneous with the Exodus itself. It's like Passover and the Exodus are one, and all of the observances are in some ways reminiscent of that event. So the meal is supposed to be a reenactment of that event, but it also takes a lot from the time that the Seder was created. Because the Seder wasn't created in the Torah. The Seder was created later on, primarily by the rabbis, which is why in your Haggadah it keeps quoting, like it quotes Rabbi Akiva. Well, Rabbi Akiva is not in the Torah, right? Rabbi Akiva came 1,000 years later after the Exodus, and he lived in Roman times, and the Haggadah is a product of Roman society, just as the Exodus is a product of ancient Near Eastern society. Okay, so the way the book is structured is basically the place that it has in the 5 books is Genesis is the creation of the world and the beginning of the people. Exodus is the formation of the people by slavery and wandering, and then all the rest of the book, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is the formation of the people by wandering and what they need to do once they get into the Promised Land. The 2 other points that I want to make about Passover, and then we can open this up for discussion, is first of all, the idea that the central celebration of freedom is a family meal sort of merges Genesis and Exodus together. It reminds you that the Torah is built on a family, right? Because that's Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, and on, all of Genesis is about a family. So it returns you to the origin of the Torah, and the fact that unlike any other meal that I know of, I suppose there's one other parallel in Judaism itself, but I don't know of one in any other tradition. It's a meal governed by a book. I don't know of any other meal where you have to actually read the book in order to know what to do at the meal every year. And that also reminds you that the nature of the Jewish tradition is, since it's born in a foreign land and it's a tradition of wandering, that even though it is a temple-centered tradition, its sacred thing is a word, and the sanctity is a book. And, you come into any synagogue in the world and you're always facing the book. So the Passover in that way is a sort of summary of everything that Judaism is supposed to stand for. The liberation to God, the book at the center, the miracles that God, and the parallel with creation, because the plagues, I didn't say this, but the plagues are a sort of undoing of creation. God creates light, there's a plague of darkness. God creates the creatures of the air and the sea, and then the sea gets diseased, and the creatures of the land get diseased, and the creatures of the air become their own plague, that is the locusts. It's like one after another, you can see how there are parallels between the creation and the destruction of Egypt. So it reminds you of creation. And finally, and this is, I think we downplay this somewhat, but shouldn't so much. The end of history is hidden. Like, we know that there's supposed to be a Messiah at the end of history, but we don't really understand how or why or who. And what represents the Messiah at the Seder meal is the Afikomen, which is hidden. And then you reenact this idea that in the end, the Afikomen is found and, everything is whole again. But of course, that's a reenactment like all the rest of it's not true. And in the Messianic times, there is a prophetic statement that a little child will lead them. So also the child orientation, which any future-oriented civilization has to be child-oriented, right? That statement, that great statement from I think it's the Medzabodzer Rebbe, that starts the movie The Kindertransport, is a child without parents is called an orphan, and a people without children is called an orphan. So if you don't have children, then that's the end of it. And that's part of the reason why Passover, which is a strangely forward-looking holiday for something that celebrates something in the past, because it's about ultimately messianic redemption, ends with the songs intending to keep the children awake. Okay, so that's a quick resume of Exodus and Passover, and I'll pause for questions or comments or whatever. Yeah. Well, yes and no. The word Messiah, Mashiach B'Shamen, is mentioned and it says for example, in the end of Genesis, that the scepter will never depart from Judah. And it says never. So in other words, it's eternal. And later on, there is mention of one who will redeem the world, but that's more in the prophetic writings than in like the famous, here's the famous, I don't know if you guys know this, the most famous and contested passage between Jews and Christians is Isaiah 53. I'll just give you a little bit. He has grown his favor like a tree crown, smitten and afflicted by God. He was wounded because of our sins, right? All of this Christians take to apply to Jesus, but when he bore the guilt of many and made intercession for sinners. So there are figures like that are mentioned throughout prophetic writings who are going to bring redemption, and there are certainly mentions of messianic times. On that day, this will happen, that will happen. And like statements like you get at the end of the Aleinu, on that day God will be one and God's name one, which is a messianic statement too. And also an interesting one that we say that because it suggests our part in it. Because God's name being one, why isn't God's name one now? Only because human beings don't think of God as one, right? So Right. Yeah. Yes. So the tabernacle, the rabbis comment that the same gold can be used for the calf or for the tabernacle, um, and and it's clear that the tabernacle is intended to give people something that they can look at. And I mean, when you go, for example, to the Western Wall, there's a veneration for the stones that bothers some people because it's really hard for people to worship an abstraction. They want something concrete. It's why idolatry is so persistent in human. So the tabernacle, I'm sure, got the same kind of I mean, look when we carry the Torah around and people kiss it. It's something, and human beings need, I remember once reading in one of Emerson's essays, he says that all abstract terms start as physical terms. So like righteous comes from right, dexterous comes from right. Sinister comes from left. Sinistral is left. He said, if you go back far enough, we can't think without the body. So the same thing here, like you need something, and the tabernacle provides that material basis.
Does it also give you a way to tolerate?
Probably.
Because you're carrying with you.
You're carrying God with you, so it's okay. You've got a safety net. And in fact, not only tolerate wandering, which is certainly true, but when the ark is stolen in the time of David, it's a huge crisis in Israel. And when they get it back, there's a giant celebration, leading to the break between one of the breaks, maybe the break between Michal and David. When they bring the ark back, David is dancing around the ark, and his wife Michal is like, that's really inappropriate for the king to be dancing like that. And that was the end of their relations from that day on. So go figure. Yeah.
When I went to the hotel,
Right.
from Solomon's.
They were from the Second Temple. They were for the outer wall of the Second Temple. Herod built those stones. Yeah.
So I didn't feel it was
Yeah.
was to put my hands on it and look up.
I think that people, I'm glad that you were on the trip.
So much.
I think that people have a powerful experience there in part because they know how many Jews have both wished to be there and have been there in the course of so many centuries. So it carries a lot of yearning, that single spot. Yeah. Yes. So, how much idolatry infected Israel is a subject of a lot of discussion. There's clearly the names of some idols are used, not idols, gods, rather, ancient gods are used in the Bible and reused. Like Tehom, which is the depth, probably comes from the ancient Semitic god Tiamat. And which is what I mean I think it's in the Sumerian legend. The god is cut in half, and one becomes the sky and one becomes the earth. Baal, which is a Canaanite god, but we use the word Baal this and Baal that for God sometimes. So yes, there clearly was borrowing. I mean, if you think, maybe we're more American than Israelites were Canaanites. I don't know. It's hard to say. But when you think about how you live in a culture and how impossible it is not to absorb from that culture, you realize what Gershon Cohen has this great essay. Gershon Cohen was the former chancellor of the seminary and a brilliant historian. And one of his essays is called The Blessings of Assimilation. And in it, he quotes this rabbinic statement that the reason that the Jews were redeemed from Egypt was because they didn't change their names, they didn't change their language, and they didn't change their clothing, right? They kept dressing the same way. And then he goes throughout Jewish history and talks about how Jews constantly change their names, their language, and their clothing. He says, starting in the Bible, he says, Moses, Aaron, Pinchas, Hophni, they're all Egyptian names. They're not Hebrew names. The Talmud is written in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. And Aramaic is a Babylonian language, right? And in the Talmud, you get Rabbi Alexander. Now, does Alexander sound Hebrew to you, or maybe a little Greek? And Rabbi Aristobulus. And that's just, I mean, it's impossible for people not to absorb from one another. Even unconsciously, we absorb from one another. So, yeah, Canaanite gods definitely had an influence on Israel's religious development. But it's, if you don't believe that Judaism came full force from the mind of God at Sinai. But in order to believe that, you have to ignore a lot of evidence. So, okay. Yeah. There are a million answers to that, and really, I don't think we have time to do it anything like justice. But the answers range from, because not written by God doesn't mean not touched by God at all, and there's a whole range of ways in which you can say that this is a collaboration. It's in response to God's revelation of self, on and on and on and on. So, to say that this wasn't written every word by God is not the same as to say it's Harry Potter. In other words, now, if you think, though, that only human beings wrote it, let's say you take God totally out of the picture, which I don't, but many people do, it's still the product of Jewish history and Jewish experience and Jewish aspiration and Jewish value and Jewish learning. So in that sense, and because if it wasn't written by God, it was clearly written by many Jews over many centuries, what you're holding is sort of a combination of the family diary and also the family value system. So there's that reason too. And then the other reason is because so many Jews have held it so holy, have lived and died for it, so it should mean something to us there. But that doesn't begin to exhaust the reasons that are possible. I think all modern non-fundamentalist Judaism is in part an attempt to answer that question. So I'm not sure we'll be able to do it this morning. But on that note, yes, let's take one more. Right.
So what happened with that, and what is
Well, the question was, the Torah starts off with, let's just go 3 days in the desert to worship. Moses asked that, right, exactly. That's all he wants. I think that is an attempt to show how deeply unreasonable Pharaoh is. Moses just wants a little thing, just a little concession. But I don't think that anybody believes that that's where Moses was going to stop, right? Having received, I mean, isn't that how you're supposed to negotiate? You start with a small concession. You don't start with, let everybody go and destroy your labor base. You go with, no, let us just observe. And it also shows that Pharaoh's objection was religious as well as economic. He wouldn't even let them pray, probably because they weren't going to pray to him. Angela Cohen asked in the chat, apparently, why Moses wasn't allowed to go into the land of Israel, and that is a great question that we have answered before, and I'm sure we'll answer again. But for the moment, we're going to leave that aside because that would be another class. Anyway, all right, since I won't be seeing you not in Torah class anyway, before Passover, I hope you have a Chag Kasher V'Sameach, a kosher and joyous Passover, and thanks for coming. Bye. Whatever the Wednesday is after Passover.